All right, thank you for coming to our Lunch and Learn. The Lunch and Learn series is an initiative of the HEAL, Humanities, Ethics, Art, and Law program at the Keck School of Medicine. The series recognizes the importance of bringing scholars in the humanities, social sciences, film, theater, and law to support our collective understanding of the health of individuals, communities, and societies. We are super excited and so pleased to have Professor Darby Saxbe with us today. Dr. Saxbe is Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of the Center for the Changing Family at the USC. You live on UPC usually, right? Yeah, it's confusing. It takes like 3 years. She holds a PhD in clinical...
Recording in progress.
Thank you. Psychology from UCLA and a BA in Psychology and English Literature from Yale. Her study, Hormones Across the Transition to Child Rearing, or HATCH, was funded in 2016 by a 5-year career award from the National Science Foundation. It followed first-time expectant parents from pregnancy across the first year postpartum in order to understand the factors that predict successful adjustment to parenthood. Today's talk focuses on the fathering brain, an under-researched area of parent-child scholarship. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Saxbe as she talks to us about the transition to parenthood as a window for biopsychosocial health in adulthood.
So just so I can be sure who I'm speaking to, so are most of you medical students? Current, yes, and you can hear me okay? Oh, do I need to turn something on? We're going to get closer. Let's see. Am I more audible now? Yeah. Okay, excellent. And what stage are you all at in your training? Is this a mix of you're mostly first years? Are you all first years? Majority first years? Okay, well, welcome to medical school. My sister went to USC Med School, actually, so I feel like I know this program well and how excellent it is. Okay, so I am, as per the introduction, I'm a clinical and health and developmental psychologist. I cannot pick just one subfield within psychology. I want to have them all. And I study close relationships in transition, focusing primarily on the transition to parenthood. So I am, as was stated, a professor here at USC over on the other campus, and I have been studying the transition to parenthood both in my research and also in my personal life over the past decade. So that's a picture of me at my PhD graduation with my newborn, and you know, research has kind of converged and been me search ever since then. So today I'm going to talk about why I think the transition to parenthood is so interesting. And I will talk about what we know and what we still have to learn about the neurobiology specifically of fatherhood. And then I will try to kind of hone in on the work that my lab is currently doing to look at neuroendocrine adaptations to fatherhood in first-time parents. So here we go. This is a clip from the classic, I actually think this is Paddington 2. Fun fact, thank you so much. Highest rated movie of all time on Rotten Tomatoes. I think it's tied with Citizen Kane. My kids are very fond of citing that fact. So here is just a clip of what it looks like when a father transitions to parenthood.
No way, baby!
But becoming a father does strange things to a man.
Could you be careful? There's a baby here. Could you step back? There's a baby coming through. Could you keep those flowers away, please? She's too young for pollen.
Where's the bike, darling?
This is our new car.
What?
So this is a pretty exaggerated depiction of the transition to parenthood, but I think there's some sort of like anecdotal grains of truth there that we become transformed when we suddenly assume caregiving responsibility for another person. And I think the transition to parenthood is interesting because it represents a convergence or an intersection of a lot of interesting domains of both mental and physical health, right? So You see transformation at the level of the brain and the body, and I'll kind of dive into that a little bit more over the course of this talk. A lot of our evidence comes from animal models that finds remodeling to the brain. You also see psychosocial transition, right? We change our sense of self, our social roles, our close relationships start to shift. There is this sort of, like as early as the 1950s, researchers were saying the transition to parenthood is a crisis point for a marriage. So it realigns our couple relationship. And then also behavioral change. Changes obviously to our sleep patterns, which we know become scrambled with the advent of a new baby, but also to our exercise, our eating habits, and our daily routines. And all of those shifts then have implications for domains of lifespan health. So thinking about weight gain and weight retention as inflection points for obesity in adulthood, for example, right? There's a lot of evidence that our trajectories of body weight can be shaped in part by weight that's gained over the perinatal period. Risk for mood disorders. So many women and also some men experience their first symptoms of depression in the postpartum period, and there's some evidence that that can have a kindling effect, which increases risk for mood disorders at other points across the lifespan. And then also thinking about allostatic load, right? So processes like stress and inflammation and metabolic functioning, and how all of those may be shaped by stress that occurs across this transformative transition. And all of that is within the larger context of our public policy and the level of social support that we offer to new parents, right? So it's hard to overstate the extent to which the US is an outlier when it comes to parental leave. We are the only industrialized nation, not just the only wealthy nation, but really like one of the only countries globally that doesn't offer any federal paid parental leave policy. And so our average paid family leave is just a few weeks as compared to almost any other country you can think of. And that's kind of accompanied by some sort of cultural expectations around parenthood, right? The idea that our body should bounce back shortly after birth, or that we should be able to return to work quickly, with no sort of conflict, right? Back to work. There are lots of stories about people taking the bar exam, days after delivering an infant. So those cultural messages are part of the picture too. And one might wonder whether that sort of policy picture and that cultural picture puts new parents at risk, right? Because we know that times of transition, times of plasticity are also times of vulnerability. So kind of zeroing in a little to set the stage on what I'm talking about when I talk about brain remodeling, right? We know that we have these kind of key critical windows across the lifespan. Certainly in infancy, even extending into the fetal stage when, there's just tremendous growth of new neurons and acquiring lots of new experiences. But there's also been increasing evidence for sort of a second window of enhanced plasticity in adolescence, where the brain is starting to reorganize to serve some of the evolutionarily salient goals of that life period, like individuating from family of origin, becoming more sensitive to risk and opportunity. So I would argue that the transition to parenthood is a really understudied but equally plausible potential critical window of enhanced biobehavioral plasticity. We see this sort of increased literature pointing to structural and functional brain change, not just in rodents or biparental mammals, but also in humans. And we also know that parenting requires investment, it requires skill acquisition. If you think just about the sort of like thought experiment of what happens in the first 30 seconds after a baby cries, we have to do a whole lot of different things, right? We have to orient to the sound of the distress. We have to sort of detect, what the baby might need to be comforted, right? So we have to engage our executive functioning, our planning, our decision making. We might have to experiment with a couple of different strategies to soothe the infant before we're successful. And most importantly, we need to find the experience not aversive, right? It has to be rewarding enough that we're going to continue to provide intensive care to infants who come into the world, essentially unready to function independently. So we need to be motivated to provide that intensive level of care. So when you think about, what parts of the brain are sort of implicated in that repertoire, you're thinking about the prefrontal lobes, you're thinking about your mentalizing network, your social cognition areas. You're also thinking about subcortical reward, motivation, salience detection, emotion processing centers. So, and in fact, that lines up with a lot of where we see remodeling across the transition to parenthood. I think fathers are particularly interesting when it comes to looking at plasticity because they do not experience directly the sort of obligate hormonal events of pregnancy, but they do have a variable range of parenting experiences. So if we want to think about experience-dependent plasticity, we should be looking at dads. And by the way, I'm saying moms and dads because that's really where the research literature is. Like, so much of this work comes from animal models, and so there's a lot of sort of assumption that gender identity and biological sex line up in the work that's been done. I think there's tremendous potential to look at more gender diverse parents as another way to really understand what are the sources of plasticity in the kinds of experiences that we have. So we know that fathers' hormones can be dynamic across the transition to parenthood, as can their sleep, their mental health risks, other behaviors, their couple level functioning. And I would also make the case to a room full of future doctors that if we understand more about fatherhood, we can understand the factors that shapes men's health in midlife and beyond. So I'll tell you about a couple of testosterone studies, right? So we know testosterone stimulates sort of male secondary sex development. It's been associated in the kind of psychobiology literature with mating, competition, dominance hierarchies. And we know that biparental mammals show drops in testosterone during the postpartum period that are associated with reduced aggression towards juveniles in the nest or in the cage. In humans, the literature is smaller, but there's some evidence that lower levels of testosterone and perinatal decreases in testosterone can be found in partnered fathers compared to single non-fathers. And that men who show stronger decreases in testosterone may demonstrate more sensitive caregiving or greater investment in the co-parenting relationship. So this idea that like we are very plastic organisms and they're adaptive, like there are sort of adaptive windows where like change might actually serve our goals, right, our motivations. So a collaboration with Robin Edelstein, who's at the University of Michigan, we use multi-level modeling to look at changes in men and women's testosterone across pregnancy. We had a pretty small sample, but we found some interesting things so that men who showed stronger drops across, this was like an intensively sampled testosterone within these first-time expectant parents. If men showed stronger drops in testosterone and they showed more synchrony with their partners, they subsequently, 3 months postpartum, reported greater investment in the co-parenting relationship. And my lab is just about to submit a paper kind of replicating that effect of stronger testosterone drops and within couple linkage as sort of an adaptive marker of the transition to new fatherhood. So I think one interesting question, if we sort of accept that testosterone is dynamic in males becoming fathers, is what might the implications be for mental and physical health, right? So I talked about risk for depression in the postpartum period, and we see higher prevalence in new fathers than we do, compared to general population men. So there's some evidence that this perinatal period is not just sort of risky. When we think of postpartum depression, we usually think about mothers, but it's something that can affect new fathers as well. And there have been some efforts to understand the sort of biological or hormonal bases of depression in women, but nobody has really looked at this in men. So this was a project that I did in collaboration with Chris Dunkelstetter, who's over at UCLA. We had a multi-site study funded by NACHD to look at low-income parents across a number of different cities. And we were curious to see whether fathers' testosterone levels would be linked with their depressive symptoms in the postpartum period. We found, interestingly, they were, and actually in opposite directions for fathers and mothers. So among new fathers who had lower testosterone, they reported more depressive symptoms. Among women having higher testosterone partners actually was linked with increased risk of postpartum depression. So what's good for the goose is not good for the gander, right, in this finding. And the effect for moms was fully explained by maternal relationship satisfaction. So women with higher testosterone partners in the postpartum period reported more distress in their relationship, which then fueled their postpartum depressive symptoms. We also found higher testosterone in the males predicted more intimate partner aggression as reported by mothers, and predicted more parenting stress as reported by fathers. So I think this sort of suggests like the role of testosterone in the family is complex. There have been some arguments made that when men are depressed, we should supplement their testosterone. And in fact, you know, you can like just sort of peruse Twitter or the internet and see lots of ads for testosterone supplementation that are directed at men. But it actually, like, it affects our sort of relationship context at a potentially sensitive time. My sort of hunch about what's happening for the lower testosterone men who are more depressed is that if it's a marker of their caregiving investment, it's just that taking care of a baby is really tedious, boring, isolating, repetitive. And so they're sort of getting like a little bit of, you know, what a lot of women with postpartum depression also report. There was a little bit of a happy medium in this study where men were doing fine at sort of average levels of testosterone. Both they and their partners were non-depressed. So it's really out on those tails where the men either had particularly low testosterone or particularly high testosterone that you saw risk both for the males and for their partners. Okay, so this is just kind of continuing in this idea of like, what do we know about men's health and how can we reframe it through thinking about parenthood? This was a kind of fun review paper that my lab wrote. We called it the Dad Bod paper. There's some evidence that, you know, like I talked about sort of obesity as being one of the adult health domains that can be affected in new parents. And again, when we think about postpartum weight gain and weight retention, we typically think about mothers. There's actually both research evidence and anecdotal evidence that males gain weight in the perinatal period as well. One study that followed individuals over about 15 years found that fathers weighed 14 pounds more than similarly aged males who hadn't become fathers. Interestingly, there was like a British newspaper poll of many thousands of individuals that also asked about weight and weight gain in the postpartum period that strangely came up with that same number, 14-pound weight gain. So maybe there's something magical about that 14-pound number. But there's also some evidence from animals like primate body size becomes larger when male biparental mammals become fathers. It might have to do something with like mate guarding or protection. So anyway, our review paper was just designed to try to explore, like, if this is the case, what are some potential mechanisms? And so we used like a highly scientific, like, traffic light approach to just like grouping what we thought was the quality of the evidence, right? Like green light means pretty good evidence on both fronts. Yellow light means slow down. Red light means it's not on this graph because we didn't include it in the paper. So testosterone we thought was a pretty plausible mechanism, right? It's potentially dynamic across the transition to parenthood, and it's implicated in adiposity, body composition, and weight gain. So if testosterone is dropping, it might make sense that, that men are gaining belly fat in particular. Cortisol we thought is one mechanism that needs more exploration, both for whether it's dynamic in the perinatal period and also the extent to which it affects weight gain. Sleep definitely was like green light all the way. We know that sleep worsens during the transition to parenthood. We also know that sleep is important for obesity risk. Exercise mood disorders, we still need a little more evidence. And then partner effects, right? The idea that couple weight gain patterns tend to mirror each other. And so that it may just be that if moms are eating more across the perinatal transition, that's affecting, you know, the sort of the type of food that's available in the household. Yeah.
Do others look at the relationship between some of the behavioral effects of sleep and exercise and hormonal?
Yeah, we have not yet because we've just been collecting that data, but that's one of the goals, is to actually sort of move from kind of a more theoretical review paper to actually starting to test some of these effects. The literature on this is really vanishingly small. Like, I know of maybe 2 studies that have looked at weight gain in new fathers. at least at the time that we wrote this paper a few years ago. And none of them have really looked at these mechanisms and how they interact with each other. So I think there's a whole like research program that somebody could like pick up and run with on this area of like obesity, weight gain risk, and fatherhood. Okay, so that actually brings me, that's a good transition to talking about the data that my lab has collected to kind of answer some of these questions. So the Hatch study, which was funded by the NSF career grant, is a longitudinal study of cohabiting couples adjusting to parenthood. And our questions were, you know, what factors can we pick up on before a baby comes that will give us clues about how adjustment to parenthood will go? You know, can we identify potential windows for intervention or targeting of folks who maybe need more support? Can we characterize what's changing in men becoming parents? We have a sample of 100 couples altogether. The original goal was 110, but the pandemic got in our way and also kind of screwed up some of our follow-up. So we wanted to have a larger MRI study. I was hoping to have 40 or 50 fathers, but pandemic. But the MRI study, we scanned dads during their partner's pregnancy. So we recruited cohabiting couples so that we could look at hormonal linkage between or within couples. We scanned dads during their partner's pregnancy, and then again at around 6 months postpartum, so that we could look at the brain changing sort of in conjunction with some of the behavioral and self-report constructs that we were measuring. So I'm going to take you through some of our findings. With the caveat that, you know, we just wrapped up data collection kind of during and sort of towards the tail end of the pandemic. So we have lots of new projects that will be coming out and new papers that are either under review or that are still being written. So this is just kind of like a preview. So one thing we're really interested in is sort of like childbirth and the extent to which the couple level relationship is important in kind of shaping the experience of childbirth. How many of you are interested in specializing in OBGYN? 1, 2, like just a few of you. I think it's a super interesting time for all of the reasons that I just sort of explained about the transition to parenthood more broadly. I think childbirth is like this nexus of all of that kind of like all in 2 days, right? And what's been a really interesting cultural sea change is that fathers are attending birth more often than at any other time in human history. I'll talk about that more in the next slide. But in our study, we brought the couples in, looked at their hormones, had them fill out a whole bunch of questionnaires, and then we had them do some behavioral interactions, like some discussion tasks. One of the discussions was a couple conflict discussion. So we followed a pretty familiar paradigm, helping the couple select some kind of topics of contention and then encouraging them to sort of discuss those in our lab while we were videotaping them. And then we subsequently coded those videos to look at the kind of dynamics of couple behavior. So we found that when couples were more negative and less positive with each other, so they engaged in more criticism, more signs of contempt, more complaining, more, just a generally more negative tenor to the discussion, they subsequently reported both more subjectively difficult childbirth experiences and also more medically complex childbirth experiences. So we coded the birth charts to try to look at complications and complexities. And it seemed like when couples were sort of like, less aligned and had a less positive dynamic, that actually affected their birth experience several months later, right? Because they came into the lab in mid-pregnancy, so we then followed up with them right immediately after the birth. We actually went into the hospital where they delivered the baby and gave them a questionnaire, recorded some audio narration about their birth experiences, and then collected the birth charts. We also looked at cortisol levels during this conflict discussion. We found that couples showed linked or correlated levels of cortisol. We took a number of samples across the course of the lab visit, and that this degree of linkage was predictive of fathers' postpartum depression risk. Fathers who were more entrained with their partners actually showed lower levels of postpartum depression about 9 months later when they came back for the 6-month postpartum visit, and also was linked with, again, the sort of negativity of the couple's dynamic during conflict. So the sort of take-home point I want to make with this slide is just that when we think about pregnancy and childbirth, we so often think about the mother's experience only. But so many individuals, certainly not all, but many, give birth in kind of a couple relationship context with a partner present, and we need to be thinking about those dynamics too. So kind of like continuing on this theme of thinking about birth, again, childbirth to me is really fascinating. People often describe it as one of the most challenging, one of the most painful, and actually one of the most meaningful experiences that they can have across the lifespan. But very little work has focused on the sort of psychological dimensions of this experience. And, if you think about the biopsychosocial model of health psychology, the idea that, health comes from biological, psychological, and social cultural factors kind of like interacting with each other, birth is really perfect reflection of that. So this was a study that my graduate student Lizzie Aviv led. She looked at how people talked about how they reported on their childbirth experiences. And I mentioned, right, that like birth has really evolved over the last 150 years. It was once something that typically happened at home. Women labored in the company of all female birth attendants and midwives. It's now become very medicalized. It takes place in a sterile space. It's often attended by the father, which was really quite rare until just like recent human history, and now has become really de rigueur. So again, like thinking about these couple level processes is really interesting because this is a relatively new sort of development in human history. So in any case, Lizzie found that when fathers found their partner's birth experience to be more stressful, they themselves were at heightened risk of postpartum depressive symptoms 6 months later. And that's controlling for depressive symptoms that they reported to us during pregnancy. It's controlling for whether the birth was vaginal or C-section, right? But this idea of like being kind of like vicariously, subjectively stressed by a birth experience can actually like set up and shape our early experience of parenthood, right? And even our mood disorder risk. Another one of my students, Jeff Corner, unpacked couples' birth narratives. So we recorded the couples when we visited them in the hospital after they delivered. We actually had them tell the story of the birth. And he worked with a team of coders to try to look at some of the themes in those stories. He's an interesting person. He came into graduate school having worked in a cancer environment and was very interested in the role of narrative and meaning making in sort of resilience and post-traumatic growth, right? Like this idea that after a diagnosis, we often report certain psychological benefits, and a lot of that has to do with the sense of meaning that we're able to derive. So he wanted to kind of take that paradigm and apply it towards looking at childbirth, which is certainly a more positive event for many people than a cancer diagnosis, but similarly is one that might be experienced as challenge or trauma and can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So he found that when couples' birth narratives included more meaning-making language, so that includes like post-traumatic growth, benefit finding, making sense of a difficult experience, couples were buffered against declines in relationship satisfaction from prenatal to postpartum, and also reported lower parenting stress. Although there were some kind of interesting differences between fathers and mothers in that study, which is actually about to come out in the Journal of Family Psychology. Women reported better relationship satisfaction when men expressed more of a change in identity resulting from the birth, for example. So again, just kind of broken record, doubling down on that point that the couple level experiences are meaningful, birth can be very transformative, and we want to understand mental health in both mothers and fathers. Okay, so this is another project kind of looking at some of our behavioral or observational measures from this study. We were really curious about the division of infant care within couples, which is another common area of contention among first-time parents. So we had the conflict discussion as part of the visit. We also had a discussion task where couples did a who does what, basically like a checklist of different infant care tasks: changing diapers, arranging play dates, taking baby to the doctor, waking up with the baby at night, and had them estimate using different colored pens whether father or mother was going to do more of each of those tasks. And then at 6 months postpartum, we brought them back into the lab and had them use the same pens, the same chart, to see what was actually happening. So pretty unsurprisingly, couples were pretty bad at estimating what their division of labor was going to be. And in every case, they overestimated the amount that dads were going to do. And dads themselves tended to say that they were doing more both at prenatal and postpartum than their partners were saying. And that's been sort of like reported from a lot of time diary, like domestic workload research. But interestingly, she also found that when dads were doing more, they reported greater relationship satisfaction postpartum. So that there was actually a protective effect of engaging more in infant care for the quality of the couple relationship, specifically for the fathers. We also coded the language use in these discussions. We used this word counting approach to see what kinds of pronouns the partners were using. There's some evidence that using a lot of I statements reflects sort of a more individualistic approach to thinking about relationship dynamics versus using more we language. And we found that when fathers used more we language, they reported greater marital satisfaction and tended to have a more egalitarian division of labor. Question? No, okay. So yeah, they express more satisfaction with the relationship after birth. So I think that actually points to a really interesting like possible lever for intervention around like helping couples kind of better plan how they want to divide up care, and knowing that when dads feel comfortable participating more in care and they're thinking about it as more of a we level versus an I level project, they actually end up being buffered against some of the declines in relationship satisfaction. Yeah, question?
In the estimate that the couples had before the baby was born and after, was there a difference in how much more like dads expected to be doing versus how much they actually did, and how much mothers expected the dads to do versus how much they did? Like, was it the fathers and mothers equally kind of overestimate?
Yeah, so that's actually graphed right here. You can see the yellow is the fathers, the red is the mothers. So you can see postpartum, they're a little more equal. Prenatally, they're a little more equal. They're both expecting a pretty egalitarian division. And then postpartum, they're both pretty bad at guessing. So I wouldn't say, but one thing that Lizzie's working on now is sort of discrepancy analyses to see that when couples are really bad at guessing or estimating, is that linked with more relationship satisfaction declines for both partners, right? So that idea of like, are you accurate in discerning what that division is going to be? Okay, so I alluded to thinking about policy and that larger context when we think about the transition to parenthood as a potential source of stress and health disparity. So California is an interesting state to study the transition to parenthood because we actually have more paternity leave on offer than many other states. So we had the ability in our sample, even though it's a pretty small sample, to compare fathers who got some paid paternity leave with fathers who didn't. And this was a project that was led by my student, Sophie Cardenas. She found that when fathers took paid paternity leave, they had healthier looking trajectories of stress and depressive symptoms. Let me start over. When fathers took paid paternity leave, their partners showed better trajectories of stress and postpartum depressive symptoms from prenatal to postpartum. So we used repeated measures analysis to see whether there were changes. And when men had access to paid paternity leave, women were sort of buffered against increases in stress and increases in depression across the perinatal transition. Similarly, fathers' trajectories of sleep and sleep problems, specifically daytime fatigue, and self-reported stress also looked better. And so we actually turned this into a New York Times op-ed because there was a lot of grumbling last fall about Pete Buttigieg taking paternity leave. There was a lot of flack from like Tucker Carlson and this guy Matt Walsh basically saying like there's no reason for dads to really take paternity leave unless the mom is breastfeeding, and even then it's not really very useful, to sort of say that actually paternity leave is associated with these mental health benefits. You think about the cost of treating depression, and we think about like, well, what's the value of things that will prevent depression? It's very high. Depression is one of the most expensive sources of disability in the American workforce. Yeah.
Was that mediated by income, or was that father presence controlled for income that just needed?
Yeah, we did not include income in this study. So we just looked at really simply like, did they have access to paid leave or not? We did control for education, actually. And interestingly, the distribution of paid leave was not totally reliant on like higher income or better quality jobs, because some dads were taking state disability leave and some dads were getting leave through their jobs. Yeah. But that's a good question. Okay, so let me tell you about some of the neuroimaging findings before I run out of time. So kind of moving from the more psychosocial and towards some of the more neural findings. This study just recently came out. This was, so I like a little bit of backstory. A paper came out in 2016 that longitudinally looked at mothers' brains remodeling across the transition to parenthood, found that from preconception to postpartum, they showed gray matter volume reductions, especially in the mentalizing network, compared to a sample of women who were followed during the same study time, but did not become parents during that time. So I was really excited. This was a study that came out of a research group in Spain. I was really interested in their findings because they were using a very similar design as the Hatch study. So I ended up getting a Fulbright, going over there for a semester to work with this group. And then Magdalena, who was a Fulbright student in that group, ended up getting a Fulbright to come to USC and work with me. And we ended up pooling samples of men from our study and from the Spanish study. Some of the women who were in that longitudinal Spanish study were recruited along with partners. So we had cohorts of dads both from Spain and from the US. And we sort of replicated the findings that had been observed in mothers, that there were gray matter volume reductions in fathers, particularly in cortical midline structures that are linked with social cognition. And yet they were more subtle and less striking than the changes that had been observed in the mothers. And there's some evidence for maybe just like more individual differences and more variability in the father's brain. So this ended up getting a lot of attention. Let me see if I can play this video clip.
Meanwhile, fatherhood changes men's brains according to before and after MRI scans. Was that for science or just so the dads could lie down for a while? I'm good. Yeah, just put me in again.
Which is actually pretty accurate because our dads did fall asleep a lot in the scanner postpartum. And then this was like Elon Musk actually commented on a tweet about this study, which we thought was really funny. This is a paper that I have under review right now for special issue on the parenting brain, looking specifically at the left hippocampus as a potential marker of men's investment in parenthood. So the hippocampus is really interesting because it appears to be plastic in reproductive transitions, not just in humans, but in biparental mammals. And in the Spanish study of mothers, it was the only structure that actually showed significant rebound in the postpartum period. So there was volume loss, and then there was volume recovery. So in this study, I found that fathers' oxytocin levels, their change in testosterone across the perinatal period, and their postpartum investment or engagement in parenting were all linked with changes prenatal to postpartum changes in left hippocampal volume. So I've been hopefully working on like a revision to this paper that will get published before too long. In the interest of time, I'll move on and talk about just a few more imaging studies. This one was led by my graduate student, Hannah Kodum, who looked at processing of infant cry sounds in our expectant fathers, so the men who came in for the prenatal scan before their babies were born. And she found that men processed infant cry sounds compared to like a frequency matched white noise control sound in parts of the brain that are linked with salience detection, emotion processing, kind of similar to regions that are used for processing speech sound. So it was the first finding in expectant fathers that infant cry was being processed as a meaningful signal. And it was associated with men's levels of prenatal testosterone. So if expectant fathers had higher testosterone, they reported larger levels of activation to infant cry in some of the regions that we looked at. This is another set of findings from one of our prenatal scans. We did a theory of mind task that is designed to elicit neural activation when thinking about either why or how someone is executing a whole different set of actions. So individuals see a series of photos, and for each picture they're asked to make a judgment, either why is the person doing this or how is the person doing it. Are they helping someone, right, lace up a wedding dress, or are they using both hands? Are they expressing self-doubt, or are they looking to their side? The idea being that you can kind of disambiguate the mentalizing network from the mirror neuron network. And we found that when fathers had higher levels of oxytocin prenatally, they showed greater activation to that why versus how contrast in some of the well-defined regions of the brain's mentalizing network. And that those patterns of activation then predicted more attunement-oriented parenting styles about 9 months later at 6 months postpartum. We also have a resting state paper that looked at resting state connectivity, again, between mentalizing network regions, but focusing on the prefrontal cortex, and that being associated both with prenatal men's perspective taking and their postpartum engagement with parenting and their reports of effective parenting. So trying to find sort of like neural signatures of the adaptation to parenthood in men who are scanned prenatally. And then this is like brand new. My student just sent me this last week. We're looking at what's changing in brain function from prenatal to postpartum, and finding, again, in some mentalizing networks that we're seeing increased postpartum activation to infant stimuli in some of the parts of the brain that we care about and that we think are dynamic, where we see structural change in new fathers. And then this is a paper we actually just got to revise and resubmit on yesterday. Fun anecdote, which is that our lab wrote this paper in 1 day. We tried this as like an experiment. We did a 1-day retreat where we had some findings that we wanted to report. We divided the paper up into sections, and we just like banged it out. We wanted to see if we could do it, and we did. That's a picture of us at Starbucks on one of our many coffee runs that day. So we found that men's prolactin levels prenatally were predictive of their attunement-oriented parenting and their parenting stress at 3 months postpartum, and were also linked with gray matter volume reduction in the subcortex and specifically in the nucleus accumbens, which is kind of a reward and motivation based region. And this is interesting because prolactin has been associated primarily with facilitating lactation and milk letdown in mothers, but we think that it's dynamic in men who are interacting with infants. There just isn't much of a human literature looking at correlates of prolactin in males. Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is a review paper looking at fathers' prenatal influences on infant outcomes. But I will tell you a little bit about the data collection that we're doing now. So I just got an NIH grant, an R01, to fund a follow-up study of our families that we originally recruited as part of Hatch. So the children are now starting to turn 6, 7 years old. We're bringing them back to the lab. So the kids, along with their parents, many parents have separated, so maybe they're coming in with one parent and we're bringing the other parent in at a different time. But we're looking at family interactions. We're repeating the who does what task. We're giving the kids some neurocognitive assessments, and we're doing a neuroimaging scan of both the father and the child so that we can look at some of the things that we're measuring prenatally and how they might influence the child's development 7 years later. So that's where we're at with that. We have a comparison sample that we recruited in spring 2020 to look specifically at people transitioning to parenthood during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a purely online sample. We're giving them a lot of the same measures, and we have a lot of the same time points for follow-up as the larger Hatch study, but it's letting us specifically look at kind of pandemic-related processes. And then finally, I will just kind of reiterate this argument that the transition to parenthood is a potentially critical window for health. That's my critical window joke. It's a time of change in the brain, in our biology, in our stress levels, our social roles, our sleep, our weight, our mood disorder risk, and that, you know, we're very focused, I think, like NIH is very interested in trajectories of cardiometabolic health in midlife and beyond. But I would argue we should maybe move our lens like another 10 or 15 years earlier to look at this really interesting, you know, potential time to set trajectories. And another source of health disparity, right? Given that there are such big differences in who can access leave, who can afford childcare, are we kind of setting parents up to fail given the lack of a stronger infrastructure of support? I think that's a really important public health, not just a policy question, but a public health question. But there's a lot more research that we need to do. And with that, I want to thank my lab and our funders and our participating families. And I know I'm a little short on time, but happy to take any questions.